OK, it's way too far from the election to bother talking about the opinion polls when it comes to the likely federal election outcome. Believe me, while the polls are neck and neck, the coalition is in the box seat and Labor is in all sorts of strife. But two news poll figures today do warrant comment. First, the budget was popular. For every person who said the budget was bad for the economy, there were 3 people who said it was good. Well, surprise, surprise, when you throw money at everything, give people more free stuff and announce a bunch of new programs and provide tax cuts so that people can keep more of their own money, it's going to be popular. As I said last week, this is an election budget and your kids will end up paying for it eventually. The other news poll number that was not a surprise was the fact that more than 2/3 of Australians want to keep our international borders closed until the middle of next year. That just confirms everything we've seen in public responses and state election voting patterns over the past year. We are a frightened country, often reacting to the coronavirus as if it were Ebola. This attitude remains a big worry. We need to get on the front foot. In many respects, we're victims of our own success. It's best to listen to a realistic and medically cautious message from the nation's former Deputy Chief Medical Officer.
I think Australia has effectively eliminated the virus, and at this point for us, with our vaccination rates in a global pandemic, that's an excellent thing. This is a success. It's going to be a false idol in 2022, 2023, when the pandemic is still raging around the world, and yet the majority of our population is vaccinated. That's the point where we need the stepwise, methodical and cautious process to open up our international borders and, to a degree, accept COVID-19 circulating within our community.
Yeah, it's hard to argue with that logic, isn't it? Opening up, but cautiously. The trouble is fear rules in Australia at the moment. We've come a long way, of course, from flattening the curve. We now have a de facto national elimination policy, one that Canberra initially resisted, but which was imposed by panicky states like Western Australia, South Australia and Queensland, and it's now infected the federal government. Only New South Wales sticks with a pragmatic approach.
Obviously, New South Wales is keen to see us be in a position where it's safe enough to open our borders as soon as possible. And that means if we get the majority of our population vaccinated, well, then we can think about opening our international borders. And that's what New South Wales works really hard to achieve. And I hope that if the vaccine rollout is better than anticipated, that date can be brought forward.
That sounds eminently sensible too, doesn't it? But over the past few weeks, we've actually blocked our own citizens from coming home from India. Over the weekend, we kicked people off a repatriation flight from India because they tested positive or were close contacts of people who tested positive. So we condemn our own citizens to deal with their infections in India rather than bring them home. I find this extraordinary and heartless. And yes, as I highlighted at the start though, I know I'm very much in the minority. But put yourself in the shoes of your fellow Australians. Still, the Prime Minister is not in any mood to take any chances, either with infections or with public sentiment.
The key thing is the overall border arrangements, they remain in place until it's safe to do anything different. And then we work within that to do practical things that I think support the economy but keep Australians safe.
So we will remain Fortress Australia at least until after the federal election, which is one of the reasons I hope we go to the polls later this year rather than next year. The focus now is in getting the whole country vaccinated. More than 3 million of us are vaccinated already, and they're the most vulnerable people in the country. Another million or so, and we'll have everyone over 65 covered. From today, you can get an AstraZeneca jab if you're over 50. I fall into that category. Hard to believe, isn't it? But what's my incentive or motivation to get vaccinated? The country's virtually COVID-free, so my chances of getting infected are close to zero, and I'm not elderly or sick, so even if I got infected, the chances of me getting seriously ill are very low. Chances of dying again are close to zero. Yet I'm warned that there are risks with the AstraZeneca vaccine. These risks are tiny, but enough that if I was younger than 50, then this vaccine would not be recommended for me. Now, I'm certainly not an anti-vaxxer. I've been urging older people in this country and all those that I know to get the vaccine as soon as they possibly can. But we've clearly got two issues with our vaccine program in this country. One is the reliance on AstraZeneca. It's the vaccine we're making here and therefore are most reliant on, but it's not recommended for anyone under 50. That's a big constraint. But second is our overzealous elimination strategy. We're not learning to live with the virus. Instead, we're bending over backwards to keep the virus out, even blocking the return of our own citizens to do so. When we're not living with the virus, the urgency to get vaccinated just won't be there for a lot of people. It's a classic catch-22, isn't it? We won't open the country up until we're all vaccinated, but the impetus to get vaccinated just isn't as strong unless we open up the country. If I knew the virus was circulating in our community now, would I rush off and get AstraZeneca as soon as possible? I dare say I would. If I was heading overseas for work or for a holiday, would I do the same? Most certainly. So governments who will do just about anything to keep the virus out can hardly be surprised that people aren't falling over themselves to get vaccinated. That's just a practical reality. It's not my assessment. It's just my assessment of the situation in Australia. It's not my medical assessment of what's right for each of us. Each of us has to make our own decision and take medical advice from our doctors. I'll certainly take advice from my doctors, and I urge you to do the same. And I fully expect that I'll get vaccinated at some stage. But my point is that I feel no urgency whatsoever. And I know many other Australians feel exactly the same way.